Did you know that in the 20th century, doctors deliberately gave patients malaria to cure syphilis? This fever therapy won a Nobel Prize, but came at a brutal cost. It's a stark reminder of how medical logic can be both innovative and dangerously flawed. Imagine waking up with a fever in ancient Mesopotamia, believing a god had personally cursed you. This wasn't just illness, it was a message from the heavens. Across early civilizations, people saw sickness as direct communication from angry deities who controlled health and fate. Communities turned to priests instead of physicians, because healing meant understanding divine will, not just treating symptoms. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded specific diseases on clay tablets, naming which god sent each affliction. The goddess Ishtar was blamed for fevers, while Nergal brought plagues. Each deity had their signature illnesses, almost like a divine fingerprint. When someone fell ill, priests would examine these tablets to identify which god they had offended. The treatment involved prayers, offerings, and rituals to appease that particular deity. Medical care was essentially a religious negotiation. Egyptian doctors worked with a similar framework but added practical elements. Medical papyri, like the Ebers papyrus, listed herbal remedies right alongside incantations. A physician might prescribe honey for a wound, but also recommend a prayer to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of healing and destruction. Temples became healing centers where patients slept overnight, hoping gods would visit them in dreams with cures. This blend of spiritual and physical treatment created a unique medical tradition that lasted centuries. The Greeks had Apollo, who could both cause and cure plagues with his magical arrows. Homer's Iliad describes Apollo raining arrows of sickness upon the Greek army to punish them. His sister Artemis brought sudden death to women, while Asclepius, the god of medicine, offered healing through temple sleep and dream interpretation. This system made every illness a personal moral event. Healers had to ask not just, what hurts, but who did you offend? And how can we make them happy again? This divine framework meant illness carried heavy social and spiritual weight. Being sick often meant you had broken a religious rule or displeased a powerful being. Communities sometimes shunned the ill, fearing they had brought divine anger upon everyone. Healing required complex rituals that only trained priests could perform correctly. A simple mistake in prayer or offering might anger the gods further. This spiritual approach to medicine persisted for thousands of years across multiple cultures. It created elaborate systems of diagnosis and treatment based on interpreting divine messages. Healers developed sophisticated methods for determining which god was angry and what they wanted. The focus was on restoring spiritual balance rather than just physical health. This worldview would eventually clash with a new way of thinking about the body, one that looked inward at fluids and balances rather than upward at angry gods. What if your personality could be predicted by what was flowing through your veins? This was the central idea behind humoral theory, developed by Hippocrates around 400 BCE. Instead of angry gods, he proposed that health depended on balancing 4 fluids inside the body. Each humor corresponded to a different element and temperament, creating a complete system that explained both physical and mental states. The theory was elegant, comprehensive, and would dominate Western medicine for 2 millennia, despite being almost entirely wrong. Yellow bile was linked to fire and produced a choleric personality, prone to anger and ambition. Black bile connected to earth created melancholic individuals who were thoughtful but often sad. Blood, associated with air, made people sanguine, optimistic and social. phlegm tied to water, led to a phlegmatic temperament marked by calmness and patience. Doctors believed illness resulted from an imbalance of these humours, and treatment focused on restoring equilibrium through dramatic interventions. Medical diagnosis became a process of fluid analysis. Physicians carried special flasks to collect and examine urine, judging health by its colour, smell, and even taste. They checked for cloudiness, sediment, or unusual shades that might indicate which humour was out of balance. Medieval doctors wore these flasks on their belts as badges of professional expertise. The practice was so common that the urine flask became one of the most recognizable symbols of medicine throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Treatments aimed to remove excess humours through methods that seem extreme today. Bloodletting was the most common approach, using leeches or sharp blades to drain what was considered surplus blood. Physicians might prescribe violent vomiting to expel excess yellow bile or strong laxatives to purge black bile. Sweating treatments helped remove extra phlegm. These procedures were often painful and dangerous, sometimes causing more harm than the original illness. Patients might be weakened by blood loss or suffer infections from unclean instruments. The system's appeal lay in its seeming logic. It connected the human body to the natural world through the four elements and provided explanations for both health and personality. Doctors could diagnose and treat based on observable symptoms rather than divine messages. The theory was flexible enough to accommodate almost any ailment, from fevers to mental disorders. It created a professional class of physicians who developed complex diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols. Humoral theory persisted through Roman, Islamic, and European medicine with remarkably little change. Galen expanded the system in the 2nd century, adding detailed descriptions of how organs produced and processed the humours. Arabic physicians like Avicenna further refined the concepts in medical texts that would influence Europe for centuries. The theory survived because it offered a complete worldview, one that explained why people got sick, how to treat them, and even why they behaved certain ways. Yet this comprehensive system began showing cracks when faced with diseases that didn't fit its patterns. Epidemics like the plague swept through populations without regard for individual humoral balances. New medical observations from dissections revealed anatomical details that didn't align with humoral theory. The system that had explained everything for 2,000 years suddenly seemed inadequate when confronted with conditions that affected people indiscriminately or followed patterns the theory couldn't accommodate. What happens when a single institution gets to decide what counts as real medical knowledge? In medieval Europe, the Christian Church became exactly that authority. As the Roman Empire declined, the Church took over many functions of government, including regulating medicine and health practices. This created a system where religious doctrine often overruled scientific observation, leading to a unique blend of spiritual and practical healing that would define the period. The Church framed illness primarily as spiritual matters rather than physical ones. Sickness was either a test of faith sent by God or a punishment for sin. This perspective meant that healing often required confession, prayer, and repentance rather than medical treatment. Relics of saints became popular healing tools. People would touch pieces of bone or clothing from holy figures, believing they could transfer divine healing power. Pilgrimages to religious sites offered hope for cures, with many traveling long distances to visit shrines known for miraculous healings. This religious framework created real dangers for scientific inquiry. The Church strictly limited human dissection, considering it disrespectful to God's creation. This prohibition severely hampered anatomical knowledge for centuries. Doctors couldn't study the human body directly and had to rely on ancient texts that were often inaccurate. When new observations contradicted religious teachings, physicians risked being accused of heresy. This environment discouraged medical innovation and kept European medicine largely static for hundreds of years. Yet within this restrictive system, some religious institutions actually preserved medical knowledge. Monasteries became centers where monks copied and stored ancient medical texts by Greek and Roman authors. They maintained herb gardens and provided basic medical care to surrounding communities. These monastic infirmaries treated patients with combinations of prayer and practical remedies, creating a hybrid approach to healing. The Benedictine order, in particular, required every monastery to have an infirmary and someone trained in treating the sick. While Europe limited medical progress, other cultures advanced significantly. Arab physicians in the Islamic world translated and expanded upon Greek medical texts, making important discoveries about anatomy and disease transmission. Byzantine scholars in Constantinople preserved ancient knowledge that would later return to Europe. Medical schools in places like Salerno, Italy, managed to continue some secular medical training despite church oversight, often by maintaining careful distance from religious authorities. This created a medical culture full of contradictions. A physician might prescribe a herbal remedy based on ancient Greek knowledge, while also recommending prayers to specific saints. Apothecaries sold medicinal herbs alongside holy relics. The sick might visit both a doctor and a priest, receiving physical treatments and spiritual comfort simultaneously. Medical texts from the period often include both practical advice and religious invocations, showing how thoroughly these approaches blended together. The Church's control meant medical progress moved slowly, but it didn't stop completely. Physicians found ways to work within the system, often framing their observations in religious terms to avoid conflict. They developed subtle ways to challenge outdated ideas while maintaining the appearance of orthodoxy. This delicate balance allowed some medical knowledge to advance even under strict religious control, though it remained limited compared to other regions. This hybrid medical system would face its ultimate test when bubonic plague arrived in 1347. The Black Death killed millions regardless of piety or virtue, challenging the idea that illness was primarily divine punishment. Physicians and priests alike struggled to explain why the devout suffered alongside sinners. The plague exposed weaknesses in both religious and medical explanations, creating a crisis that would eventually help break the Church's monopoly on medical knowledge and pave the way for new approaches to understanding disease. When the Black Death arrived in Europe around 1347, it killed nearly half the population within a few years. Faced with this unimaginable catastrophe, people reached for any explanation that made sense of the horror. Medical professionals, religious authorities, and ordinary citizens developed competing theories that revealed more about human psychology than about the actual disease. Doctors trained in humoral theory blamed unusual planetary alignments. They believed the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 had corrupted the atmosphere, creating what they called pestilential air. This miasma theory suggested bad air carried the disease, so physicians advised people to avoid swampy areas and keep windows closed. Some doctors wore distinctive beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs like mint and cloves, thinking these would filter the corrupted air. They carried posies of flowers to sniff when visiting patients, believing strong smells could counteract the dangerous atmosphere. The Church saw the plague as divine punishment for humanity's collective sin. Preachers traveled from town to town describing the epidemic as God's wrath against a corrupt world. This interpretation led to dramatic public displays of penance. Groups of flagellants marched through communities whipping themselves with metal-tipped scourges until they bled, believing this self-punishment might appease God's anger. Their processions sometimes included hundreds of people chanting hymns and striking themselves in rhythmic patterns that left permanent scars. These religious explanations took a dark turn when many communities blamed Jewish residents for poisoning wells. Despite Jewish people dying from the plague at the same rates as their neighbors, rumors spread that they were deliberately spreading the disease. This led to violent pogroms across Europe. In Basel, Switzerland, the entire Jewish population was burned alive in a specially constructed building. Similar massacres occurred in Strasbourg, Mainz, and Frankfurt, with thousands killed based on completely false accusations. Local authorities tried various prevention methods based on these theories. Towns burned aromatic woods in public squares to purify the air. They banned gatherings and processions, though these rules were often ignored. Some cities established quarantine systems, forcing ships to wait 40 days before docking, a practice that actually helped somewhat by limiting the movement of infected rats. But since nobody understood the real transmission method, these measures had limited effect. The desperation for explanations led to some contradictory behaviors. People might avoid their sick neighbors out of fear of bad air, while simultaneously joining large religious processions that actually helped spread the disease. Wealthy citizens fled to country estates, though this often just carried the plague to new areas. Medical treatments ranged from the sensible, rest and simple remedies to the dangerous, like bloodletting patients who were already weakened by the disease. What's remarkable is how long these explanations persisted, even as evidence mounted against them. The real cause, Yersinia pestis bacteria, transmitted by flea bites from infected rats, remained unknown for centuries. People continued blaming bad air, planetary influences, and divine punishment through multiple plague outbreaks that occurred every generation for the next 300 years. The medical masks, the avoidance of corrupted air, and the religious interpretations outlasted countless epidemics. This episode shows how fear can override reason during crises. When faced with something they couldn't understand, people clung to explanations that fit their existing worldviews rather than following the evidence. The response to the Black Death became a case study in how societies process catastrophe, revealing the human tendency to seek meaning even when none is apparent. The real tragedy is that so many suffered and died while the actual cause remained hidden in the most ordinary of places, the fleas on common rats. What if your doctor prescribed ground-up ancient Egyptian corpses for your headache? This wasn't some dark fairy tale. It was real medicine in Renaissance Europe. The practice of consuming mummies as medicine began when Europeans discovered preserved bodies in Egyptian tombs and decided they must have magical healing properties. Apothecaries started selling what they called mummy powder as a universal remedy that supposedly treated everything from bruises to the plague. The demand quickly turned into a thriving business. Merchant ships returning from Egypt carried casks of mummy parts alongside spices and textiles. Wealthy Europeans paid high prices for what they believed was genuine ancient healing material. King Francis I of France supposedly carried a small pouch of mummy powder with him at all times, taking a pinch whenever he felt unwell. Other aristocrats followed his example, making mummy consumption a status symbol among the elite. There was just one problem. Real Egyptian mummies were scarce. unscrupulous merchants began creating counterfeits using recently deceased bodies. They would take corpses from execution sites or hospital morgues and subject them to preservation processes that mimicked ancient Egyptian techniques. These fake mummies were then ground into powder and sold as the real thing. Customers had no way to verify they were getting actual ancient remains rather than some local beggar who died last week. The belief behind this practice came from the idea that mummies contained preserved life force. People thought the ancient preservation techniques had captured the essential vitality of the person, and consuming this material could transfer that energy to the sick. Medical texts of the time describe mummy as having balsamic qualities that could restore balance to the body. Physicians prescribed it mixed with wine, water, or other liquids, believing it could stop bleeding, reduce inflammation, and cure numerous diseases. Apothecaries displayed mummy powder in elaborate jars alongside other exotic ingredients like unicorn horn and bezoar stones. The powder varied in color from dark brown to black, with a distinctive smell that customers associated with potency. Recipes sometimes called for specific types of mummy: red mummy for blood disorders, black mummy for melancholy. The substance became so popular that some medical texts listed it as a standard treatment for over 50 different conditions. Despite its popularity, there was never any evidence that mummy powder actually worked. Patients reported no better results than with other treatments, and some experienced stomach problems after consuming it. The substance was essentially powdered human remains, sometimes mixed with the resins and oils used in preservation. Critics emerged who questioned both the ethics and effectiveness of the practice, but their voices were largely drowned out by commercial interests and tradition. The trade continued for centuries because it was profitable and appealed to people's fascination with ancient Egypt. Even as scientific medicine advanced, mummy powder remained available in some apothecaries well into the 19th century. The practice only declined when new drugs replaced it, and cultural attitudes shifted against consuming human remains. But while it lasted, mummy medicine showed how easily commerce and superstition could combine to create a lasting medical tradition with no basis in reality. This wasn't the only strange substance people consumed in hopes of better health, but it was certainly one of the most macabre. The fact that educated, wealthy individuals willingly ingested ground-up corpses reveals how deeply superstition could override both science and basic human sensibility when it came to medical treatments. What if the cure for depression involved a musical instrument made of live cats? This wasn't just a dark joke. Some early medical theorists seriously proposed it. The device was called a katzenclavier, or cat piano, and it represented a whole category of medical thinking that believed shocking or surprising the senses could jolt people back to health. Physicians of the time thought that dramatic sensory experiences might reset a disturbed mind, especially for conditions like melancholy or what we'd now call depression. The design was as elaborate as it was cruel. The katzenclavier would feature a row of cats secured in individual boxes with their tails stretched out beneath a keyboard. Each cat was selected for a specific vocal pitch, creating a range of notes. When a key was pressed, a sharp pin would press into the cat's tail, causing it to cry out in pain. The resulting chorus of feline shrieks would supposedly create a strange musical experience that could shock melancholic patients out of their mental state. The theory was that the unexpected, distressing sounds would overwhelm the patient's depressive thoughts and force a mental reset. This concept didn't emerge from complete fantasy. It built on existing ideas about the relationship between strong emotions and health. Doctors had long observed that sudden fright or surprise could sometimes change a person's mental state. There were stories of people snapping out of paralysis after being scared, or forgetting their ailments during moments of intense excitement. The cat piano was simply an attempt to create that kind of dramatic intervention in a controlled, repeatable way. It was meant to be a medical instrument, not a torture device in the minds of its proponents. Similar devices used different animals or methods to achieve the same goal. Some proposals involved dogs with different bark pitches, while others used birds with distinctive calls. There were also non-animal versions that created sudden loud noises or bright lights. The common thread was the belief that mental illness required dramatic interventions that could break established patterns of thought. Physicians were essentially trying to shock the system back into proper functioning, much like hitting a malfunctioning machine to make it work again. Despite being described in medical texts and philosophical discussions, there's no evidence anyone actually built a functioning Katzenclavier. The concept appears mostly in theoretical writings from the 16th through 18th centuries. Some sources suggest it was more of a thought experiment than a practical medical device. The idea persisted in medical discussions because it represented an approach to treatment that valued dramatic intervention over gentle care. It showed how desperate physicians were for anything that might work against mental illnesses they didn't understand. The cat piano concept reveals several things about historical medicine. It shows how little doctors understood about mental health and how willing they were to try extreme measures. It also demonstrates the persistence of the humoral theory idea that balance could be restored through strong stimuli. Most importantly, it illustrates how medical theories could become disconnected from both ethics and practical reality. The fact that educated professionals seriously considered torturing animals to create a healing experience shows how far medical thinking could stray from common sense. While the cat piano remained theoretical, other shock-based treatments were actually used on patients. Some doctors prescribed sudden cold baths or frightening experiences. Others developed devices that delivered mild electric shocks to the head. These treatments continued well into the 19th century, with some physicians still believing that startling experiences could cure certain conditions. The cat piano was just the most bizarre expression of this persistent medical idea that sometimes what patients needed was a good shock to their system. This approach to mental health treatment would eventually give way to more systematic methods, but the belief in dramatic interventions never completely disappeared. Even today, some extreme treatments involve controlled trauma or shock to the system, though thankfully without the animal cruelty. The cat piano remains a disturbing example of how medical desperation can lead to ideas that seem utterly strange in retrospect, yet made perfect sense within the medical frameworks of their time. Tobacco arrived in Europe from the Americas with a reputation as a miracle cure. Early explorers reported that Native Americans used it for everything from pain relief to spiritual rituals. European physicians quickly adopted the plant, experimenting with increasingly bold applications that today seem both bizarre and dangerous. The most extreme of these was the tobacco enema, which involved blowing smoke into a patient's rectum using special equipment designed for this specific purpose. Medical practitioners developed complete kits for administering tobacco smoke enemas. These included a tube for insertion, a bellows to pump the smoke, and sometimes a nozzle to control the flow. The equipment was often made of metal or leather, with some versions featuring decorative elements that made them look like scientific instruments. Physicians would prepare dried tobacco leaves, light them to create smoke, then use the bellows to push that smoke into the patient's intestines. The whole process was considered a legitimate medical procedure. This treatment was primarily used for resuscitation, particularly for drowning victims. The theory was that the smoke would warm the body and stimulate breathing reflexes. Rescue societies along rivers and coasts kept tobacco enema kits ready for emergencies. There are accounts of these devices being used on people pulled from the water, with practitioners claiming successful revivals. The treatment was also prescribed for digestive issues like constipation or stomach cramps, with doctors believing the smoke could relax muscles and restore proper function. Tobacco found many other medical uses during this period. Doctors prescribed smoking tobacco for respiratory conditions like asthma, believing it could clear the lungs. Patients with headaches were told to inhale tobacco smoke or chew the leaves. Tobacco poultices, fresh leaves applied directly to wounds, were common treatments for everything from minor cuts to serious infections. Some physicians even recommended tobacco for toothaches, having patients hold crushed leaves against their gums. The medical establishment took these uses seriously enough to debate them formally. The Royal Society in London discussed tobacco's medical properties in the 1600s, with members presenting papers on its effects. Some physicians argued for its widespread use, while others expressed skepticism about its benefits. These debates reflected the growing scientific interest in understanding how new substances from the Americas might be incorporated into European medicine. Tobacco was studied alongside other imports like cinchona bark and coca leaves. Despite its popularity, evidence began mounting that tobacco caused more harm than good. Patients receiving enemas sometimes suffered burns or tissue damage from the hot smoke. Those smoking for medical reasons developed coughs and breathing problems. Physicians noticed that tobacco users often became dependent on the substance, needing larger doses to achieve the same effects. These observations gradually shifted medical opinion against tobacco treatments. The decline of tobacco enemas was accelerated by better understanding of resuscitation techniques. Methods like artificial respiration proved more effective for drowning victims without the risks of internal burns or nicotine poisoning. As medicine became more scientific in the 19th century, physicians demanded evidence that treatments actually worked rather than relying on tradition. Tobacco enemas couldn't meet this new standard and gradually disappeared from medical practice. This pattern of adopting a new substance with extreme enthusiasm, then abandoning it as risks became clear, would repeat with many other plants. Tobacco was just one example of how medical practitioners could become excited about a novel treatment without fully understanding its effects. The same cycle would occur with substances like opium, mercury, and various herbal remedies that promised miracle cures but delivered mixed results. The tobacco enema episode shows how medical practices can sometimes pursue logical ideas to illogical extremes, with patients bearing the consequences of these experimental treatments. What if a doctor tried to save your life by injecting milk into your veins? This actually happened in the 19th century when physicians experimented with milk transfusions. The idea emerged as doctors were beginning to understand blood circulation, but didn't yet grasp immunology or biochemistry. They noticed that milk looked similar to lymph fluid, that clear liquid that sometimes seeps from wounds, and made a dangerous logical leap. If milk could nourish babies, perhaps it could nourish adults when introduced directly into their bloodstream. The first experiments began in the 1850s, with doctors reporting their results in medical journals. They used cow's milk, sometimes warmed to body temperature, and injected it directly into patients' veins using early syringe technology. The physicians believed the fat globules in milk might replace lost blood cells or provide essential nutrients to weaken patients. Some thought milk could stimulate the body to produce more blood, while others saw it as a direct substitute for blood transfusion, which was still risky and poorly understood at the time. The results were immediately disastrous. Patients experienced violent reactions within moments of the injections. Their pulses would drop dramatically, sometimes becoming barely detectable. Many developed high fevers and chills as their bodies reacted to the foreign substance. Some patients began vomiting uncontrollably, while others passed out from the shock to their systems. The milk, which was harmless when digested, became toxic when introduced directly into the bloodstream. Despite these alarming outcomes, some physicians persisted with the experiments. They tried diluting the milk with water or sugar solutions, thinking this might reduce the adverse effects. Others experimented with different types of milk: goat's milk, sheep's milk, even human breast milk, searching for a version that might work. A few doctors argued that the initial reactions were just part of the healing process, and that patients would improve after overcoming this temporary crisis. They continued injecting milk into critically ill patients, often with fatal results. Medical journals of the period contain case reports that read like horror stories. One doctor described injecting 4 ounces of milk into a cholera patient who immediately collapsed and died. Another reported using milk transfusions on women suffering from severe bleeding after childbirth, only to watch them deteriorate rapidly. The physicians noted the terrible reactions in detail, but often attributed them to the patient's underlying condition rather than the treatment itself. The practice continued for nearly 2 decades, despite mounting evidence of its dangers. Part of the persistence came from the desperation of physicians facing untreatable conditions. When patients were dying of blood loss or extreme weakness, doctors felt compelled to try anything that might help. The theoretical foundation, that milk resembled lymph and could nourish the body, seemed logically sound within the medical knowledge of the time. It took years of failed experiments and dead patients before the medical community accepted that milk transfusions were inherently dangerous. This episode wasn't an isolated case of medical misjudgment. Around the same time, doctors experimented with transfusing blood from animals to humans, with similarly disastrous results. Others tried injecting various chemical solutions, oils, and even alcohol directly into veins. The milk transfusion story represents a broader pattern in medical history, where theoretical ideas out practical understanding, leading to harmful experiments on vulnerable patients. It shows how even intelligent, well-meaning doctors can pursue dangerous treatments when working with incomplete knowledge. The practice finally declined as better understanding of immunology emerged. Scientists began realizing that introducing foreign substances into the bloodstream could trigger fatal immune reactions. The development of safe blood typing and transfusion techniques in the early 20th century made milk transfusions obsolete. What began as an apparently logical idea based on observable similarities ended as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing medical theory beyond what evidence supports. What if the best treatment for rheumatism involved sitting inside a dead whale? This was an actual medical practice in 19th century Australia that became known as the whale hotel cure. When a whale washed ashore near a coastal town, people with joint pain and inflammation would literally climb inside the massive carcass seeking relief. They believed the decaying whale's body heat would sweat out inflammation and ease their aching joints, creating one of history's most unusual natural remedies. The treatment worked like this. After a whale stranded itself and died, townspeople would cut an opening in its side. Patients suffering from rheumatism would then enter the body cavity and remained there for several hours. The decomposing whale maintained an internal temperature much warmer than the outside air due to bacterial activity breaking down tissues. This created a natural sauna effect that practitioners claimed reduced the swelling and pain in arthritic joints. Some reports mention patients staying inside for up to 30 hours at a time. Word of this unusual treatment spread quickly through coastal communities. There were no medical journals or official studies, just personal testimonials from people who claimed it worked. One man reported being unable to walk before entering the whale, then walking away pain-free afterward. These stories created enough local demand that when a whale washed ashore, it became a temporary medical facility rather than just a source of oil and bone. People would travel from neighboring towns to take advantage of the opportunity. Practical challenges made the experience far from pleasant. The smell of decaying whale blubber was overwhelming, with many patients vomiting from the stench. The carcass decomposed rapidly, sometimes becoming unstable within days as gases built up inside. There were safety concerns about the structure collapsing on occupants. Temperature control was impossible. Patients had to endure whatever heat the rotting carcass generated, which could become dangerously high. Despite these issues, the promise of relief kept people coming. Local newspapers reported on these events with a mix of fascination and horror. Articles described lines of people waiting their turn to enter the whale. Some carried there because they couldn't walk independently. Journalists noted the bizarre sight of human figures moving inside the whale's ribcage through the opening cut in its side. Some reports questioned the practice's safety and effectiveness, while others marveled at human ingenuity in using natural resources for healing. The term whale hotel appeared in these accounts, capturing both the temporary nature of the treatment and its strange hospitality. The practice eventually declined as scientific medicine advanced. Doctors began understanding rheumatism better and developing more effective treatments. Public health officials raised concerns about infection risks from sitting in decomposing tissue. The rise of proper hospitals and clinics made people less likely to seek out such extreme folk remedies. By the early 20th century, the whale hotel cure had largely disappeared from medical practice, surviving only as a curious footnote in medical history. This wasn't the only animal-based treatment that persisted into the modern era. People continued using everything as medicine well into the 20th century, applying frog spawn to burns, drinking powdered elk antler for vitality, or wearing eels around the neck to cure sore throats. The Whale Hotel represents a particularly dramatic example of how people would try almost anything when facing chronic pain, even if it meant sitting inside a rotting marine mammal. It shows the length people would go for relief before modern medicine offered better alternatives. What's remarkable is how recently such practices occurred. The last documented whale hotel treatments happened in the 1890s, well into the age of germ theory and modern science. This timing shows how folk remedies could coexist with scientific medicine, especially in remote areas where doctors were scarce. The whale cure demonstrates that medical progress didn't happen evenly. Some communities held on to traditional practices long after they'd been abandoned elsewhere. How did a medicine containing morphine become one of the most popular baby products in America? Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was a patent medicine that promised relief for teething infants and restless children. It was sold from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, marketed as a gentle remedy that would calm fussy babies and help them sleep. The syrup came in attractive bottles with cheerful labels showing happy, peaceful infants. Mothers across the country bought it, trusting that it was safe for their children. The product's secret ingredient was morphine, a powerful opioid painkiller. Each bottle contained enough morphine to potentially stop a baby's breathing. The syrup also had high alcohol content, sometimes as much as 65 proof, stronger than many liquors. These ingredients worked together to make babies stop crying, because they were essentially being sedated into unconsciousness. Parents saw their children becoming quiet and sleepy, and believed the medicine was working as advertised. Manufacturers knew the dangers but continued production because the syrup was extremely profitable. The formula was created by Charlotte Winslow, a nurse who originally developed it for her own children. Her son-in-law, Jeremiah Curtis, recognized its commercial potential and began mass production. They never revealed the active ingredients on the label, describing it only as containing vegetable extracts and other harmless-sounding components. The company spent heavily on advertising, placing ads in newspapers and magazines that reached millions of readers. Thousands of babies died from accidental overdoses of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The instructions advised giving teaspoon doses to infants, but even small amounts could be fatal to young children. Many parents, seeing the medicine seem to work, gave larger doses or used it more frequently than directed. Some babies died after their first dose, while others developed addictions from regular use. Medical professionals began noticing patterns of infant deaths connected to the syrup, but without regulation, they couldn't stop its sale. The company defended its product despite growing evidence of harm. When doctors raised concerns, manufacturers claimed their formula was perfectly safe when used as directed. They pointed to the many customers who reported positive experiences and dismissed negative reports as misuse by careless parents. The business expanded internationally, selling the syrup in Britain and other countries under the same cheerful branding. Profits continued flowing even as the death toll mounted. Public outrage finally forced action in the early 1900s. Muckraking journalists exposed the dangerous ingredients in patent medicines, including Mrs. Winslow's syrup. The American Medical Association conducted chemical analyses that revealed the morphine and alcohol content. These findings shocked parents who had trusted the product for years. The resulting public pressure helped pass the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which required accurate labeling of medicinal ingredients. The law forced Mrs. Winslow's to reveal its formula on the label, though the company continued selling it with minor modifications. Sales gradually declined as parents became aware of the risks. The product finally disappeared from the market in the 1930s as stronger regulations took effect. The story of this deadly syrup became a catalyst for modern food and drug safety laws that protect consumers today. This wasn't an isolated case. Many patent medicines contain dangerous ingredients like cocaine, arsenic, or opium. These products claim to cure everything from cancer to tuberculosis, while actually providing temporary symptom relief at best, and causing addiction or death at worst. The legacy of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup shows why we have regulations requiring drug companies to prove their products are safe and effective before selling them to the public. What if you could regain your youth by receiving animal testicles? Serge Voronov claimed this was possible through monkey gland transplants in the 1920s. The Russian-French surgeon became famous for his controversial procedures that promised to reverse aging and restore vitality. He transplanted slices of chimpanzee testicles into wealthy older men who sought renewed energy and sexual potency. Voronov's operations captured public imagination at a time when science seemed capable of overcoming nature's limits. The procedure involved taking thin slices from chimpanzee testicles and grafting them onto human testicles. Voronov claimed the animal tissue would merge with the human organs and begin producing rejuvenating hormones. He performed hundreds of these operations in France and other countries, charging enormous fees that only the wealthy could afford. His clients included aristocrats, businessmen, and celebrities who hoped to turn back their biological clocks through this radical intervention. Voronov reported dramatic success stories from his procedures. He claimed patients experienced increased energy, improved memory, and enhanced sexual performance. Some supposedly regained hair color or saw wrinkles disappear. These reports created massive publicity that drew more clients to his clinic. Voronov published books and articles promoting his methods, complete with before and after photos that appeared to show remarkable transformations. The medical establishment remained skeptical, but the public was fascinated. The initial positive results were likely due to placebo effects or exaggeration. Patients who paid large sums for the procedure wanted to believe it worked. Some may have experienced temporary psychological boosts that they interpreted as physical rejuvenation. Others might have exaggerated their improvements to justify the expensive treatment. There was no scientific monitoring or follow-up studies to verify Voronov's claims objectively. Serious problems emerged as more procedures were performed. Patients developed infections at the transplant sites as their bodies rejected the animal tissue. Some suffered from immune reactions that caused swelling and pain. The chimpanzee tissue didn't integrate with human organs, as Voronov claimed, but instead broke down and caused inflammatory responses. Several patients required additional surgery to remove the deteriorating grafts and treat resulting complications. The medical community gradually turned against Voronov's methods. Other surgeons attempted to replicate his results, but found no consistent benefits. Research showed that transplanted animal tissue couldn't function properly in human bodies. The hormones produced by animal testicles weren't compatible with human physiology. By the 1930s, most doctors considered monkey gland transplants dangerous pseudoscience rather than legitimate medicine. Voronov's reputation declined along with interest in his procedures. The development of synthetic hormones offered safer alternatives for treating age-related issues. Better understanding of immunology explained why animal tissue transplants would always fail. The monkey gland experiments became a cautionary example of how charisma and bold claims could temporarily override scientific skepticism. This episode wasn't an isolated case of rejuvenation hype. Other doctors experimented with similar approaches using different animals or tissues. Some tried transplanting entire organs from primates to humans, while others injected animal gland extracts. These experiments consistently failed, but continued attracting desperate patients hoping for miraculous cures. The pattern repeated throughout the 20th century as new miracle treatments emerged and then collapsed under scientific scrutiny. Monkey gland transplants represent a recurring theme in medical history, where hope outweighs evidence. Patients facing aging and decline often grasp at dramatic solutions that promise quick fixes. The story shows how, even in modern times, medical practices can be driven more by wishful thinking than solid science. Voronov's operations remain a striking example of how far people will go in their search for youth, and how easily scientific credibility can be stretched beyond breaking point. What if you saw hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets until they dropped dead? This happened in Strasbourg, France in 1518, when a dancing plague swept through the city. It began with a single woman named Frau Trophäa, who started dancing in the street and couldn't stop. Within days, dozens of others joined her, and soon hundreds were caught in the same uncontrollable compulsion to dance. They kept moving for days without rest, their bodies failing from exhaustion, while their minds seemed powerless to stop the motion. The dancers weren't enjoying themselves. They appeared tortured and desperate. Many danced until their feet bled, some until they collapsed from heart failure or strokes. Historical accounts describe them as being in a trance-like state, often crying out in distress while their bodies kept moving against their will. Local authorities initially thought this was a physical disease and tried to treat it with conventional medical thinking of the time. Their solution was to build a large stage and hire musicians to play continuous music, believing that if people danced intensely enough, they might get it out of their systems and recover. This approach only made things worse. The constant music and organized dancing space encouraged more people to join the frenzy. What began as a strange individual behavior became a mass event that spread through sight and suggestion. People watched others dancing and suddenly found themselves compelled to join, as if catching the behavior through observation. The epidemic continued for weeks, with new dancers replacing those who collapsed or died from exhaustion. Doctors and officials eventually realized this wasn't a typical physical illness. They noted that the dancers showed no fever or other signs of infection, and the behavior seemed to spread through psychological rather than physical means. The city council changed tactics, banning music and public gatherings instead of encouraging them. They organized religious processions and prayers, thinking spiritual intervention might help where medical approaches had failed. Gradually, the dancing subsided, though some participants reported recurring episodes for months afterward. This event shows how powerfully belief and suggestion can create physical symptoms. The people of Strasbourg were living through difficult times with famines, diseases, and economic stress. Many believed in a curse associated with Saint Vitus, who was thought to punish people with dancing mania. This cultural belief created a framework where people could interpret unusual physical sensations as signs of possession or punishment. Once the first cases appeared, the idea spread that dancing was something that could catch from others. Similar mass psychogenic illnesses have occurred throughout history. In the Middle Ages, groups of people would suddenly begin dancing together in what was called St. John's dance or tarantism. More recently, there have been outbreaks of shaking, fainting, or mysterious symptoms in schools and factories where no physical cause could be found. These events often happen in communities under stress, where people are particularly suggestible to seeing and copying unusual behaviors. The dancing plague reminds us that illness isn't always about germs or physical damage. Sometimes, the mind can create very real physical symptoms, especially when people are frightened or under pressure. It shows how quickly unusual behaviors can spread through a group when people believe something is happening to them. Even today, doctors encounter cases where multiple people in a community develop similar symptoms with no clear medical cause, proving that the human mind remains capable of creating physical realities that defy simple explanation. How did a bacterial infection become a verdict on someone's character? When syphilis appeared in Europe around the late 1400s, it quickly became more than just a disease. It became a moral label. Unlike other illnesses that might strike anyone, syphilis carried an immediate assumption about how the person had lived their life. The infection spread through sexual contact, and that fact shaped how society viewed everyone who contracted it. Different countries gave syphilis names that blamed their political enemies. In Italy, It was called the French disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. Russians referred to it as the Polish disease. The names showed how people used illness as a way to criticize other nations and cultures. These labels stuck for centuries, turning a medical condition into a tool for prejudice and nationalism. Religious leaders framed syphilis as divine punishment for sexual immorality. Preachers described it as God's judgment against sinful behavior. This interpretation meant victims were often seen as deserving their suffering rather than needing compassion or medical care. The moral judgment became part of the treatment, or lack thereof. Many believed that since the disease was punishment, attempting to cure it might interfere with God's will. Medical treatments focused on mercury, which caused terrible side effects. Doctors prescribed mercury ointments, pills, or steam baths, believing the metal could drive out the disease. Patients often suffered mercury poisoning, losing teeth, experiencing nerve damage, or developing kidney problems. The treatment was sometimes worse than the disease itself, but physicians continued using it for centuries because they had few alternatives, and the theory seemed logical based on their understanding of how metals worked on the body. The disease progressed through horrifying stages that made the stigma worse. It began with sores, then progressed to rashes, fever, and joint pain. In later stages, it could cause paralysis, blindness, and mental deterioration. The visible signs made it easy to identify sufferers, who often faced social isolation. The slow progression meant people lived with both the physical symptoms and social rejection for years or even decades. Victims faced rejection from their communities and families. Many were forced to leave their homes or jobs once their condition became known. Hospitals sometimes refused to treat syphilis patients, considering their condition self-inflicted. This isolation drove many sufferers to seek treatment from unqualified practitioners or try dangerous homemade remedies. The social punishment often compounded the physical suffering, creating a double burden for those infected. The situation only began to change when doctors separated morality from medicine. In the late 19th century, physicians started treating syphilis as a medical problem rather than a moral failure. This shift allowed for more objective research into causes and treatments. The discovery of the bacteria that caused syphilis in 1905 helped further remove the moral stigma by showing it was simply an infection, not divine punishment. Effective treatment finally arrived with penicillin in the 1940s, but the moral judgments lingered. Even after antibiotics could cure the infection, the social stigma persisted in many communities. It took decades of public education to separate the disease from moral condemnation completely. The history of syphilis treatment shows how medical progress often requires overcoming social and religious beliefs that have little to do with actual health outcomes. This separation of medicine from morality enabled real scientific progress. Once researchers could study syphilis without preconceived notions about sin and punishment, they made rapid advances in understanding and treatment. The pattern repeats throughout medical history. When we stop judging patients and start treating diseases, everyone benefits. The story of syphilis reminds us that effective healthcare requires seeing people as patients first and moral subjects second, if at all. Why would doctors infect patients with one deadly disease to treat another? This exact approach earned Julius Wagner Jauregg the Nobel Prize in 1927 for his development of fever therapy. The Austrian psychiatrist noticed that mental patients sometimes improved after suffering high fevers from infections like malaria. He wondered if deliberately inducing fevers could treat other conditions, particularly late-stage syphilis, which caused neurological damage and mental deterioration in its final phases. Wagner Jauregg began experimenting with malaria-infected blood transfusions in 1917. He would take blood from malaria patients and inject it into syphilis sufferers who had developed paralysis and dementia from the disease. The malaria caused intense, recurring fevers that spiked as high as 106 degrees Fahrenheit. These extreme temperatures actually killed the heat-sensitive syphilis bacteria in some patients, halting the progression of their disease. For the first time, there was a treatment that could stop late-stage syphilis from advancing further. The treatment came with terrible risks. About 15% of patients died from the malaria itself, rather than the syphilis. Others suffered permanent damage from the extremely high fevers. The treatment required careful monitoring. Doctors had to control the malaria infections with quinine once they'd served their purpose. Patients endured weeks of shaking chills, drenching sweats, and dangerously high body temperatures. The experience was brutal, but for many, it was better than the certainty of progressive paralysis and mental decline. Medical ethics were different in the early 20th century. Wagner Jauregg didn't need the extensive informed consent we require today. Many patients were already institutionalized with advanced syphilis and couldn't make decisions for themselves. Families often agreed to the treatment out of desperation, seeing it as the only hope against a disease that was always fatal in its late stages. The dramatic nature of the treatment, using one disease to fight another, captured public and medical imagination. The Nobel Committee recognized Wagner Jauregg's work as a significant advance, even with its high human cost. At the time, anything that offered hope against syphilis was considered progress. The treatment spread to hospitals around the world, with physicians using malaria and sometimes other fever-inducing methods. Some doctors experimented with heated chambers or electrical devices to create artificial fevers, though these were less effective than actual infections. Fever therapy represented both a step forward and an ethical dilemma. It showed that syphilis could be treated, even in advanced stages, challenging the belief that nothing could be done for these patients. But it also demonstrated how far doctors were willing to go with dangerous treatments when facing fatal diseases. The approach worked through brute force rather than precision, sacrificing some patients to save others. This treatment remained in use until antibiotics became available in the 1940s. Penicillin provided a much safer and more effective cure for syphilis, without the risks of malaria infection or extreme fever. The transition from fever therapy to antibiotics marked a shift from dangerous, broad-scale treatments to targeted, scientific approaches. Wagner Jauregg's method faded into medical history, remembered more for its dramatic nature than its practical application. The fever therapy story shows how medical progress sometimes moves through uncomfortable stages. Treatments that seem extreme in retrospect might represent the best available option at the time. It also illustrates how medical ethics have evolved, with greater emphasis on patient safety and informed consent. What won a Nobel Prize in 1927 would be considered ethically questionable today, demonstrating how our standards for medical treatment continue to develop alongside our scientific knowledge. Do mass hysterias still happen in our modern scientific world? The answer is yes, and they might be more common than you think. These episodes continue to occur around the world, showing how easily groups of people can develop shared physical symptoms without any medical cause. Modern mass psychogenic illness reveals the same patterns seen in historical cases like the dancing plague, just with contemporary triggers and faster spread through modern technology. In 1999, hundreds of schoolchildren in Kosovo suddenly developed mysterious symptoms, including headaches, dizziness, and difficulty breathing. They reported smelling a strange odor before getting sick, leading to fears of chemical poisoning. Schools evacuated and hospitals filled with affected students. After extensive testing, no toxic substances were found. Investigators concluded this was a case of mass psychogenic illness, likely triggered by anxiety from recent conflicts in the region, combined with a harmless odor that became the focus of collective fear. More recently, in 2019, several schools in Malaysia had to temporarily close because of screaming outbreaks. Students would suddenly begin screaming uncontrollably, sometimes dozens at a time. The episode spread from school to school, with students describing feelings of being touched or chased by invisible forces. Religious and cultural beliefs about spirits played a role in how students interpreted their experiences. Despite thorough investigations, no environmental or medical cause was ever identified for these coordinated outbursts. In Afghanistan between 2009 and 2012, multiple outbreaks affected schoolgirls who reported strange smells followed by dizziness and fainting. Some communities blamed poison attacks by opponents of girls' education. International investigators found no evidence of poisoning, but noted the girls were under tremendous social pressure. These episodes often occurred in communities where female education faced opposition, creating high-stress environments where psychological symptoms could easily spread through suggestion. These modern cases share important characteristics with historical mass hysterias. They typically affect groups under significant stress, whether from political conflict, social pressure, or cultural tensions. The symptoms are real and physically experienced, not faked. They spread through sight and suggestion, with people seeing others become ill and then developing similar symptoms themselves. The episodes usually resolve when the group separates or when authorities provide reassurance that no physical threat exists. Modern technology has changed how these events unfold. Social media and instant communication can spread symptoms faster than ever before. A single video of someone experiencing symptoms can trigger similar reactions across multiple locations. News coverage sometimes amplifies the spread by giving attention to the phenomenon. At the same time, modern investigation methods help identify these cases more quickly through environmental testing and medical evaluation. What's fascinating is how these episodes reveal the ongoing tension between biological and psychological explanations. Even with advanced medical testing available, communities often prefer physical explanations for these events. People find it easier to accept the idea of poisoning or environmental contamination than to consider that their minds could create such real physical symptoms. This resistance shows how persistent the mind-body divide remains in how we think about health and illness. These cases continue to challenge medical professionals and investigators. They require careful handling to avoid dismissing people's real suffering while also preventing unnecessary panic. The best approach usually involves thorough investigation to rule out physical causes, followed by sensitive communication of the psychological nature of the outbreak. This balance is difficult to achieve, especially in communities where psychological explanations might be stigmatized or misunderstood. Modern mass hysterias remind us that the human mind remains powerfully influenced by social and psychological factors, even in our scientific age. They show that the same mechanisms that caused dancing plague centuries ago still operate today, just in different forms. These episodes provide a window into how groups process stress and anxiety through physical symptoms, and how quickly shared beliefs can create shared experiences of illness. The line between physical and psychological causes remains as blurry today as it was in the past, proving that medical science still has much to learn about the complex relationship between mind and body. How did medicine finally break free from 2,000 years of misunderstanding? The answer arrived through a revolutionary idea so simple, yet so radical, that doctors initially refused to believe it. Germ theory proposed that invisible organisms cause diseases, not bad air, not angry gods, not unbalanced humors. This fundamental shift in thinking didn't happen overnight. It faced decades of resistance from medical professionals who found the concept too strange to accept. The first clues appeared centuries earlier, when early microscope users saw tiny creatures in water and other substances. Anton van Leeuwenhoek observed what he called animalcules in the 1670s, using his handmade microscopes. But most doctors dismissed these findings as curiosities with no medical significance. They couldn't imagine that creatures too small to see could possibly affect human health. The medical establishment remained committed to humoral theory and miasma explanations for illness. The resistance became personal for Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s. This Hungarian doctor noticed that maternity patients died much more frequently when treated by doctors who came directly from autopsy rooms. He hypothesized that doctors were carrying something invisible from dead bodies to living patients. His solution was simple: wash hands with chlorine solution between procedures. The result was dramatic. Maternal deaths dropped immediately. Yet other doctors rejected his findings, insulted by the suggestion that their hands could carry disease. Semmelweis was eventually dismissed from his hospital, and his ideas ignored for decades. Louis Pasteur faced similar opposition when he presented evidence supporting germ theory in the 1860s. His experiments showed that microorganisms spoiled food and caused diseases in silkworms. He developed pasteurization to kill these microbes in wine and milk. Many scientists criticized his work, arguing that spontaneous generation, the idea that life could arise from non-living matter, explained these phenomena better than invisible germs. The scientific community debated these ideas for years before gradually accepting Pasteur's conclusions. The change required abandoning medical theories that had dominated for centuries. Doctors had to stop blaming imbalances and start considering external causes. They needed to accept that their own hands could carry disease, that the air contained dangerous organisms, and that cleanliness mattered more than they'd ever imagined. This shift challenged professional pride and established practices. Many physicians continued using bloodletting and other traditional treatments, even as evidence mounted for germ theory. Hospitals slowly began adopting new practices based on this understanding. Surgeons started sterilizing instruments and cleaning wounds properly. Joseph Lister developed antiseptic techniques using carbolic acid to reduce surgical infections. These methods faced resistance too. Some doctors found them too time-consuming or unnecessary. But the results spoke for themselves. Patients survived operations at much higher rates when surgeons followed antiseptic procedures. The acceptance of germ theory transformed every aspect of medicine. It led to development of vaccines, antibiotics, and proper sanitation systems. Public health measures like water treatment and food safety regulations emerged from this new understanding. Doctors could finally explain why diseases spread and how to prevent them. The change saved countless lives and created modern medicine as we know it. Yet even this revolution built on earlier medical observations. The emphasis on cleanliness echoed ancient practices in some cultures. The idea that diseases could spread through contact wasn't entirely new. people had long noticed patterns of contagion, even if they misunderstood the mechanism. Germ theory didn't emerge from nothing, but rather provided the scientific explanation for observations doctors had been making for centuries. The real breakthrough was connecting those observations to the invisible world microorganisms and developing methods to combat them. This transition shows how medical progress often requires rejecting comfortable ideas in favor of uncomfortable truths. It demonstrates that even the most established theories can be wrong, and that scientific advancement depends on willingness to question everything. The story of germ theory reminds us that today's medical certainty might have been yesterday's radical idea, and that keeping an open mind remains essential for future discoveries. So what does this entire strange journey through medical history actually teach us? It reveals that every generation of doctors worked with the best information they had available. Physicians in ancient times weren't foolish for believing gods caused diseases. They were following the most logical explanations their culture provided. Medieval doctors weren't ignorant for balancing humors. They were using the most systematic medical framework available to them. Even the most bizarre treatments usually emerged from reasonable premises, given the knowledge of the time. The tension comes from recognizing that good, intelligent doctors often reached completely wrong conclusions. Medical practitioners genuinely wanted to help their patients. They observed symptoms carefully, developed detailed theories, and created elaborate treatments. Yet they frequently missed the mark because they lacked fundamental knowledge we take for granted today. They couldn't see microorganisms, understand immune responses, or analyze chemical interactions in the body. They worked with partial information and did their best to fill in the gaps. Consider how humoral theory provided a complete system for understanding health and disease. It connected the human body to the natural world through the four elements. It explained why people had different personalities and why they responded differently to illnesses. The system allowed doctors to diagnose and treat patients systematically rather than randomly. It represented a major advance over simply blaming spirits or gods, even though it was fundamentally incorrect. Divine explanations served an important psychological purpose too. Believing illness was punishment from gods provided meaning to suffering. It allowed people to make sense of why bad things happened to good people. Religious frameworks offered comfort through rituals and prayers that gave patients and families a sense of control. These beliefs helped people cope with the terror of unexplained illnesses in eras without scientific medicine. Many bizarre treatments emerged from logical starting points. Tobacco enemas seemed reasonable when doctors believed tobacco had healing properties. Milk transfusions made sense when physicians noticed similarities between milk and bodily fluids. Even the whale hotel cure followed logical patterns. If heat helped inflammation, and a decaying whale generated heat, then sitting inside might provide relief. The premises were sound, even if the conclusions were dangerous. Medical progress rarely moves in straight lines. It involves wrong turns, dead ends, and occasional steps backward. The acceptance of germ theory took decades despite overwhelming evidence. Useful ideas like Semmelweis's hand washing were rejected while dangerous practices like bloodletting persisted. Change happens slowly because medical traditions become deeply embedded in professional culture and personal identities. This history suggests that today's medical certainties might become tomorrow's curiosities. Treatments we consider standard now might seem strange or dangerous to future generations. Medical knowledge continues evolving as we learn more about the human body and disease processes. The scientific method allows for constant revision and improvement. but it doesn't guarantee we have all the answers right now. The story of medicine shows both human creativity and human limitation. Our ability to develop complex theories and treatments demonstrates remarkable intelligence and imagination. Our tendency to cling to those theories, even when evidence contradicts them, shows our cognitive biases. Medical history is ultimately about people trying to understand and control their bodies using whatever tools and knowledge they have available. This journey continues every day in laboratories and clinics around the world. Researchers are still making discoveries that challenge established medical beliefs. New treatments emerge that might someday make current practices seem primitive. The process of questioning, testing, and revising medical knowledge never really ends. It just becomes more sophisticated with better tools and methods. What remains constant is the human desire to understand illness and find ways to relieve suffering, no matter how strange the path may sometimes appear. From divine curses to germ theory, our journey through medical history shows humanity's endless creativity in facing the unknown. Each generation used the best knowledge available, even when that meant prescribing ground-up mummies or tobacco enemas. Remember that today's medical certainties were yesterday's bizarre speculations. Modern doctors recognize that current practices may look strange to future generations. The next time you encounter an unusual medical belief, consider what aspects of our own healthcare might someday seem equally curious. Medical progress continues evolving, reminding us that understanding disease remains an ongoing process of discovery and revision.